Let's go to one we're in favor of, Mike, and that's racial profiling, a bill addressing racial profiling.
Sure. Racial profiling has been on the legislative agenda now for as long as I've been advocating at the General Assembly. And it's last year they came very close to a legislative resolution, only to have it break down at the last minute. And there were a variety of reasons for that, but suffice it to say that there was no agreement, and so we're back at where we started in 2004 when comprehensive legislation was passed. Basically, and the most important part is, and I'll just read it, no state or municipal law enforcement officer or law enforcement agency shall engage in racial profiling, period. And then it goes on to define what racial profiling means for the purpose of that statute that passed in 2004. Well, what we know is that from the statistics and from the work that the ACLU has done is that racial profiling still goes on in this state. And the statistics that I've seen are pretty striking in that regard. And this is an incredibly intrusive and demeaning process that goes on in our communities across the state. And there have been attempts to try to work this out, but the thing that, and not to minimize how intrusive and demeaning that is, but the thing that seems to, or ought to get the most traction is the fact that this is just not very wise law enforcement policy. And the reason we say that is we know, again, from the statistics that, from the numbers, that the searches of minorities of their motor vehicles are less productive in producing evidence than those of non-minorities. So that gets you into the whole business of how are we allocating resources, how is law enforcement allocating their resources? We ought to take a look at this. And the legislation that the ACLU has submitted and that has been worked on for quite a while now is pretty minimal. It simply asks that the police document the reason that they stopped the car, they stopped the individual, that they document what their reasonable suspicion or probable cause is. There are some protections in the legislation for juveniles, that juveniles cannot be subject to consent searches, because we've heard the stories from members of the minority community, the youth minority community, that are just horrible about the profiling that goes on in the community with juveniles. So it's, these are, what's going on now is really questionable practices and policies that are being pursued by the law enforcement community, and hopefully, whether this legislation passes or something like it, it will address the issue in some meaningful way.
We've discussed racial profiling all the years that we've had this program, the TV program. This has been a topic of our shows. We've come some way with this in some previous successful legislation, but it seems we're stuck at the moment in moving forward.
Well, I think there has been success, if you can call that, on a couple of levels. One is that every year it seems like they're getting a little bit closer. Last year, it was really, really very close. And there was agreement up until the last minute, and it kind of blew up. And the other thing that's going on behind the scenes is we hear that the law enforcement community, that they're improving their training, that they're working with other groups to, try to do training for the police officers to address that issue. And that's very important. So we're hopeful this year that something will get done in that regard. Yeah,
and just to highlight the point, Black and Latino drivers are more than twice as likely to get stopped in this state than white drivers. But they're mostly false positives. There's nothing there.
That's right, and that was what I was referring to.
Right,
that they're not, those searches are not productive.
Fruitless.
They're fruitless. And so you then say, okay, where does that, what does that speak to as far as the relationship between law enforcement and the communities that they're supposed to protect? It's a real problem and a real issue that on a number of different levels, are folks, are they going to trust the police officers in their community that are sworn to protect them? Hopefully this will be the year something positive will happen.
It seems like it's time for this one to move along.